Hey there, art nerds. Today we are giving Supervision a chance at some art supply redemption. We're going to be taking a look at the Supervision tube watercolors. In the past, we took a look at their half pans and I put them to the field test. Today we're going to be taking a look at their tubes, setting them up in the half pans and painting a watercolor field test with them. So if you are interested in these watercolors from China, make sure you stay tuned to find out if these are a good fit for you. Look what came in today. I have been waiting on this and I can't wait to show you guys what's inside. Let me grab my scissors and we can get to snipping. This came from AliExpress. How do I know that? Well, most of my packages from AliExpress seem to ship out of Inglewood, California. Took about 2 weeks to arrive, and it was the last part of a larger order, so I am happy it is here. It arrived very, very well wrapped, plenty of bubble wrap, which I will try to recycle. If you ever order something from the Natto shop and it has somewhat suspicious looking bubble wrap like this, it's because I try to recycle a lot of the plastic and cardboard and brown paper packaging that gets sent my way. Just trying to keep it out of a landfill, try and keep it out of the ocean. So it isn't that I'm trying to be cheap, it's that I'm trying to keep it from getting just totally wasted. And I will usually throw away the stuff that is just too damaged to be recyced. So generally, if you receive a package from me, you can probably further recycle that bubble wrap if you so desire. They're gonna make me cut both sides of this. This is gonna end up with all these gubbins all over the table. Don't love that, but that's okay. It is, as you guys can see, extremely sturdily wrapped, maybe overpackaged, definitely overpackaged, because inside is even more bubble wrap. And I don't really understand why they took that track, but here we are, and it smells kind of bad. It's got that AliExpress watercolor smell to it, which is always makes me a little nauseous, makes me a little lightheaded. Not a good sign. Jeez. Okay, maybe I can finally crack this thing open. I don't know. Ha, all right, there we go. So many layers of protection. We don't need this many layers of plastic. So, come on. Try not to damage the interior packaging. Oh, this is something I ordered. It is not what I thought it was. Wow. Okay. Wow. Okay. All right. I'm on board now. Okay, so it is a Supervision watercolor palette of their more standard colors in tubes. I purchased this from the Dingyi boutique store. So here you can see my order from AliExpress. It arrived today. Supervision 24 colors, illustration, watercolor tube, 8 milliliter professional watercolor paint for drawing, painting, art supplies. Produced by CAAM, and I have talked about Supervision, and I have talked about Supervision granulating colors, as well as I believe I have reviewed their half pan watercolors. So I had kind of mixed feelings about them. Some of them I really liked. Some of them I felt were kind of lackluster, and I wanted to give the tubes a try. And this was made possible thanks to y'all's generosity over on Patreon. So if you find reviews like this helpful, useful, and informative, you guys can join me over there. But this is what I paid. There are 24 tubes in this set. It was not purchased on any particular special deal, and it was purchased from a store on AliExpress that I buy from pretty frequently. So it's a store that I feel safe with using for the most part. I don't feel like I've ever been misled or taken advantage of or received something that was significantly different from what I ordered. They carry a lot of Paul Rubens stuff. They carry a lot of like Bauhang watercolor paper. So if you're looking to get a hold of some of the watercolors that I've reviewed here from AliExpress, I've had good success with the Digny Boutique store. So here we have the Supervision Illustrator and Designers watercolor. This is their 24 color set, and it is manufactured by CAAM. So you guys know I have talked a lot about Supervision here on the channel, particularly in terms of the It Came From AliExpress series. On the back, it says product name 24 color Supervision Illustration Design Watercolor Pigment A. Size 8 milliliter by 24, raw material color powder, Arabia glue, preservative, ox bile, environmental protection standard ENV 71 3 Llama /ASTM D4236, testing agency Intertech Testing Group. And the producer is the Hangzhou Zhang's Cultural Goods Co. Limited. And as I mentioned, we have reviewed a lot of different Supervision products in the past, including their half pans. So make sure you check the description down below if you're curious about this brand. But now it is time to go ahead and get this thing opened up. That lid was really hard to open. So we have a really nice pearlescent finish that the camera does not want to capture. It's a little challenging to read the text on the lid. And then inside we have 2 rows of 12 tubes organized in color order. And they look just so aesthetic and so pretty. So what we're going to do today is we're going to actually decant these into half pans. We are going to swatch them while they're still wet. We are going to do a little bit of color mixing, and then I'm going to let them dry out for a while in their half pans, and we're going to re-swatch them to test and see how well they reactivate, because not all watercolors set up very well in half pans, as I saw years ago when I reviewed Artesa's tubes. So I have here a Meeden empty palette with 24 half pans, and looks like this. Very, very cute. And I'll link them down in the description below if you guys would like to order your own. And the nice thing is, it already has our half pans all in place. So I am basically going to take the tubes and put them in here in the same order, and we'll get to swatching from there. I'm going to do 1 tube live for you guys, and then I'm going to do the rest in time lapse. They are really in that foam packaging. It holds it very secure. The exterior of the tube says Supervision China. This one is skin color. You guys cannot see. It is number 123. Over here it says Series A, 8 milliliters. Pigment CI name P073 PW6. It is semi-opaque with 3 stars of light fastness. And as you guys can see, it is a fairly small 8 milliliter tube with a plastic cap. I'm going to go ahead and unscrew the cap. And sometimes with watercolors ordered through AliExpress, they can be a little explodey. This one seems all right so far. Squish it just a little bit to get it to go back into the tube. Recap it. And then I am going to put it in backwards so I know where I'm at, tubes versus half pans. The colors in the 24 color set are Skin Color Orange, Toluidine Red, Opera Red, Orange Lake, Lilac, Permanent Violet, Ultramarine, Brilliant Blue, Brilliant Blue again. These have the same name, but they contain different pigments and they are a different series number. Light Sky Blue, Dark Cyan, Light Turquoise Hue, Permanent Green Yellow, Sap Green Deep, Garcinia Hue, Yellow Deep, Gold Ochre Deep Tea, Burnt Sienna, Burnt Umber, Dinosaur Fossil Brown, and Phthalo Blue. And I will have the pigment information as well as the opacity and light fastness information in the description below if you guys are curious. Each tube has the color name, pigment information, series number, transparency, and light fastness information. I also didn't notice any substantial separation or just general weirdness, and none of the tubes burped the way many tubes do when they come from overseas, particularly when I'm ordering from AliExpress. No real complaints when filling these half pans. None of these had like obvious separation of pigment and binder. The only one that was a little bit of trouble was, looks like it might be, let us see, let's find out, Deep Tea. But even that, I would call that very minimal. So generally, I don't like working straight from tubes because I have a tendency to pick up way more pigment than I want. So even though I am going to swatch them both from tubes and dried out, my primary use case with watercolor is working from dried half pans and reactivating them. That's my preference as a watercolor comic artist. So I am going to go grab our Blick swatch paper and we're going to get started with our first row of swatches. We're going to be swatching on the same paper we always swatch on, the Blick Premier Cotton Rag Block Bound Watercolor Paper. This is what I use throughout the Student Grade Showdown. This is what I am now using with professional grade watercolor reviews. I've talked about this paper quite a bit in some of my other review videos, so I'm not going to go too much into the weeds talking about it today. I'm also not necessarily looking for a whole lot when it comes from this first set of swatches, because in general, this is not really how I like to use watercolors, and I find that that might skew or bias my opinions. I'm really going to save my judgment for how these watercolors perform when I'm swatching them later on after they've had a chance to dry out for a week. So let's just say that these are the initial swatches just to get kind of a feel for the colors in this palette, the granulation, the opacity, those sort of properties. Also want to give a huge shout out to my patrons. As you guys know, this channel doesn't have any outside sponsorship. I'm also not really seeking outside sponsorship. So it is my patron support and the support of my generous husband, Joseph Coco, that makes these kind of reviews possible. So if you like what I do and you want to help me to do it, unfortunately, I'm already married, so I can't get married again, but you can join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup and not only get early access to reviews like this one, but also get access to the materials that I create for my in-person classes, as well as free printable coloring sheets. So you can find me at patreon.com/natosoup. All of the materials, unless otherwise disclosed, and honestly, that is only once in a blue moon, all of the materials that I review are purchased out of pocket, generally using funds from Patreon. So it is no exaggeration when I say this is only possible thanks to the generosity of my patrons. These are still super wet from the tube, which makes color and paint handling a little bit more challenging for me. I'm doing this though more as a basis of comparison for my friends who prefer to work straight from tube watercolors. And all of the real testing I'm going to be doing with these paints are going to be done after the paints have dried out for a week. So color mixing, wet into wet, etc. So currently I am looking at opacity, granulation and staining, and how they wash out into water. They seem a bit pastel, but I'm being super careful about how much pigment I grab. So this is one of the reasons I prefer to save most of my tests till after they have dried out. Other than a few colors swatching kind of pastel, these handle pretty normally so far. They're sort of similar to my experiences with brands like Magello. I believe I swatched and field tested the 12-piece Supervision half pan palette a couple years ago, and I feel like that palette was a bit gritty. So far, I'm seeing none of that grittiness this time around. The colors are bright, most are fairly finely milled, and it also gives off Paul Rubens and older Mei Liang pigments vibes. It'll be interesting to see what changes after letting them dry out for a week. So other than a few of the colors swatching kind of pastel, these handle pretty normally so far. They're sort of like my experiences with Magello. I believe I swatched and field tested the 12-piece Supervision half pan palette a couple years ago, and I feel like that palette was kind of gritty. That was one of the reasons I didn't like it, is considering I paint all these teeny tiny faces. I felt like the grittiness just didn't work well for that kind of application. So far with this palette, I'm seeing none of that grittiness. The colors are bright, most are fairly finely milled, and it also gives off Paul Rubens and older Mei Liang pigments vibes. It'll be interesting to see what changes after letting them dry out for a week. So that is what I am going to do. I'll see you guys in a week. It'll feel like no time to y'all. So these Supervision watercolors have had about a week to dry. So I am going to reactivate them with some water, and we're going to re-swatch them, as well as do our color mixing wet into wet and lift test. I pre-activated the paints with a little spritz of water and gave them a little bit of time to soak it in. In row 1, I noticed that the colors already seem much more saturated after being allowed to dry and then reactivated. One row of paint did muddy the water pretty significantly, but there are also several colors that seem designed to be opaque, although I didn't notice much line coverage while swatching these. I didn't have any problems with reactivation in the first row, and I found them much easier to work with after having let them dry out. In row 2, for the most part, colors are bright or brighter than initial from tube swatches. There's a decent mix of granulating and non-granulating colors, although the colors do seem to flood the wash area, making it challenging to see wash effects. Some of the neutrals, really just one, are reactivating a little bit weirdly. So while these finish drying, I'm going to go ahead and do some color mixing as well as the wet into wet test underneath. I want to point out though that letting them dry in half pans, they seem to reconstitute pretty well. Didn't really have any problem colors, and that the colors are as bright or brighter for me than when I was swatching them straight from the tube. For color mixing, it was fairly easy for me to mix a lot of nice secondary colors and brilliant mixes. Some of the colors offer some really lovely granulation, and I want to see how much these desaturate as they dry. Colors did not seem to desaturate significantly as they dried. For the wet into wet test, I grabbed a fresh block of cotton rag watercolor paper and I saturated the paper with water so that I could really encourage the paints to diffuse. And the colors diffused very quickly, so it was a little bit difficult to build up areas of color. You guys can see how much those pigments are moving on this paper, how much they're spreading out. And I wouldn't say I used more water for this wet into wet test than with most of my wet into wet tests. I mean, that's the point of it being a wet into wet test, but I was still kind of surprised by how much these colors moved around. It really kind of reminded me of the first time I swatched Paul Rubens tube watercolors, how they all really diffused out into soft, misty mixes. But at this point, I really hadn't noticed anything disturbing or concerning about these colors, even watching them dry. While the wet into wet test finishes drying, I am going to go ahead and do my color map for this Supervision palette. So for my painting color map, so this is the palette map, these are bright and vibrant colors for the most part. I feel like this set would be very appealing to a brush calligrapher who wants Crayola bright colors that are professional quality. I probably need to do a field test though to be able to give you guys a full verdict. I'm really thinking we're going to have to do a field test before I can talk to you guys about the pros and cons as well as the verdict. So this is going to be the final test. Before the field test, we are doing the lift test, and we're basically looking for a variety of results. Some colors should be more lifting, some colors should be more staining, and that's going to kind of tell us how these are going to handle when we do the field test. So with the lift test, some colors are lifting and some are staining, and that's what you want to see with a watercolor palette of this size. Some of your more granulating colors are going to be more prone to lifting, and some of your more finely milled colors are going to be more prone to staining. Fortunately, we do actually see a variety of lifting and staining. Some colors are fairly lifting, some are pretty staining, and that bodes well to these actually utilizing a variety of pigments rather than pigments, extenders, dyes, and then the binder. But I still think we need to do the field test before I can really give you guys a verdict of what I think about these Supervision tube watercolors. This field test was inked on Moulin de Roy watercolor paper, and it was inked with a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. I am using the half pans and I spritz them with water to reactivate them. This time lapse has been sped up 8x and then sped up again to try to condense it as much as possible for you guys. So colors react fairly quickly and are very saturated. You need a palette or a mixing surface to help with color intensity control. I did a wet into wet wash of yellow and green, and then I diffused local color for the wildflowers, as I find these sort of loose techniques make an illustration like this feel more full. All colors that I grabbed reacted fairly readily. Some were perhaps a little too assertive, like the grass green and the orange. I'm going to allow the paper to dry out fully before moving on to the next step. After that dried out fully, I washed some cool blue onto the bottom of the illustration. Well, actually, before it had a chance to fully dry, I washed some cool blue into the bottom of the illustration, and it dried a bit darker than I actually expected. Colors, particularly the cool yellow and phthalo blue, are very saturated. The phthalo blue ended up staining my hand. Not a big deal, just kind of pointing it out. Since this is a wildflower illustration, I really want to get some fun color movement and bursts of color to help fill in the grass and make the flowers themselves look more full. I'm sort of struggling a little with this. Not because of the paints, but because at the time I was working on this, I was recovering from COVID, and COVID brain is not a joke. I filled in the sky and then ended up over painting it. I was hoping for more of a gradient, but kind of lost that. And I filled in the grass with yellow to help block it in, and then filled in the grass shadow with phthalo blue, spritzed it with water to get it to move around a bit more, and then splattered in some opera, purple, yellow, and ultramarine blue to get more color movement going on. I think I'm going to let this dry thoroughly and then try to go in and define the grass with more greens. I did get a modeling over the foreground grass that I find interesting and rather pretty. I just need to figure out how to handle the grass in a way that better fills the space and that I actually like. These paints are really saturated. I believe I reviewed the pre-dried half pans that are also available and found those to be gritty. These are not. They're pretty smooth and quite saturated, so if you really like saturated watercolors, Supervision might be a good option for you. The cool yellow definitely has some opacity to it, and it's clouding the line art, but I'm not going to worry about that until the piece is all done. The colors in this set are, for the most part, really saturated, and most are very finely milled, so this might make them a little bit more challenging to handle, especially if you're used to less finely milled watercolors. I'm struggling with this set, but not really because of the set itself, but because I'm still fighting off being sick, and the Moulin de Roy paper is behaving strangely. It makes it hard to tell if I like this set or not, but at this point I was leaning towards like. Now that it's all said and done, if I found out it was full of dyes, I wouldn't be surprised, given how some of these colors are handling. I do like them better in this format than in the half pan format that I reviewed earlier. This palette doesn't include any of the colors that I would usually use to mix Kara's skin tone, so I'm going to have to try something a little bit different and see how that goes. And somehow I got a little ahead of myself in the script. It's a little bit challenging to read it because I definitely had COVID brain, and some of my spelling and some of my word usage and some of my sentence formation was, let's be generous and say unique, different from what I'm used to. So usually when I'm working on these kind of field tests, I'll take notes as I go and then read those notes for you guys during the time-lapse section. That way I'm not trying to remember everything that I thought at the time. I have those notes. Sometimes it's easier to read back those notes than other times. Sometimes I have COVID brain and sometimes I don't. So this was a unique opportunity. You guys saw me wearing the mask in that shot. I was wearing the mask inside my house because we had a quarantine room where we were staying. And then the rest of the house, Bowie, our cat, was allowed to roam freely. And I also have a pet rat, Basil. And both cats and rats are susceptible to catching COVID. And obviously, I didn't want my pets to get sick, so I opted to wear a mask while I was working on these illustrations. Just take that as a testament to how much I love and care about my pets. I'm also trying to block out and reserve some areas using some masking fluid because I'm going to do a lot of spray and wet into wet, and I felt like masking some of those areas off earlier on would be a little bit easier for me to work around, especially with COVID brain. It made it kind of challenging to tell how I actually felt about these paints versus what COVID was doing to my brain meats while I was sick. And don't worry, I know some of you guys worry about me. I did take plenty of breaks. I took plenty of naps. I took plenty of rest. And while watercolor can be kind of strenuous, let's be honest, it is something that I love and I find centering and I find relaxing. So I promise I didn't push myself unnecessarily hard. So as I mentioned earlier, this palette doesn't include any of the colors that I usually use to mix Kara's skin tone. So I ended up using a different mix for it, and I had some mixed feelings about that as well. These paints aren't terrible, but I also don't recommend going out of your way to buy these or paying more than you would for other budget professional grade watercolors like Paul Rubens or Rosa Galleria or Roman Smalls. These are very saturated, but many of the colors fall apart quickly in mixes or seem to disappear under layers or with spray. When you're doing like lighter mixes like the skin tone, like her dress, the colors fall apart very quickly. The phthalo blue also feels very synthetic, and those of you who watch my work, you know I paint a lot of nature. You guys know I use a lot of phthalo blue. I love that color. So I'm used to it being a more staining color. I'm used to it being almost dye-like. I'm used to it being almost like a candy kind of color in terms of saturation. This phthalo took all of those properties and really amped them up to 11. It's hard to put my finger on it, but I feel like I'm really just not resonating with this palette. Maybe it's because I'm having trouble building up saturation, or maybe the opacity of the earlier colors skewed the line art and the color gamut. I'm not sure. I'm almost done with the piece, but I'm going to let it dry overnight and see how I feel about it tomorrow. And with this piece, it kind of dragged out longer than I initially intended. Usually it takes me 3, maybe 4 days to paint an illustration like this, where I can put in like several 8-hour days. But because I was sick and I needed to take a lot of breaks and I needed to rest, I would work on it for about 40 minutes, be exhausted, have to go lay down. Work on it for a couple of hours, feel totally wiped, and go lay down. So it ended up taking longer to work on this than I'm used to. And I also found myself really kind of struggling to get the shading, to get the contrast, to build up the shadows, to build up the saturation for the skin tone that I wanted. And that is typically pretty easy for me to be able to build up with other watercolor paints. I also found painting Kara's hair to be a bit of a struggle because it didn't have the right colors in this set that I would normally use for her hair. It's really hard to get a variety of tints with these watercolors. They either fall apart when you mix them or they go full saturation, and it's challenging to get darker tones. This isn't a set for people who like to do a lot of color mixing. I think it might be a good fit for brush calligraphers and loose florals, since the colors are very saturated and quick to activate, but it won't stand up to a lot of color mixing or layering. For the price, and I paid around $78.28, I don't feel like these perform up to my expectations, and I find them to be expensive for the quality you receive. I realize that many Western watercolors in smaller sets cost about the same or are more expensive, but I also feel like they're capable of more than I was able to achieve with this set. For example, the 24-piece core set, which I would say is a very saturated high chroma watercolor set that is a very high quality watercolor. That set is $103.52 on Blick, and while it's more expensive, I think it's also more capable of performing to the quality we expect from professional grade watercolors. So while I was working on this piece, it was really hard for me to separate how I felt about the watercolors and how I struggled to achieve what I had in mind with how the piece itself actually turned out. I was, at the time I finished it, actually kind of disappointed with it, but I shared it online and I got some really kind feedback from people, and I also took a chance to take a step away from it and kind of let my brain forget what I'd had in mind for initially. And I found that even though this is a little bit different from what I would normally do, and I'm so sorry my head is getting in the shot, I had to be on top of it to see what I was doing. Even though it's different from what I would normally do for these kind of illustrations, I actually still really like it. I don't really like the paints, and I don't think they're a good fit for me and how I like to paint, but I do like the piece, and I think it turned out very cute and very bright and very summery, even though it's winter now, and just very friendly. And I hope you guys enjoyed painting, or probably not painting considering how fast I'm working on this thing. But I hope you guys enjoyed watching my head and watching me paint this. And hopefully the field test was helpful for you guys and helps you guys see where I'm getting a lot of my opinions from and why I feel the way that I feel. This was another watercolor review where I'm really glad I did the field test because everything seemed very promising with the initial swatches and with the re-swatches and even with the wet into wet test. And it wasn't until I sat down and did a field test that I started to notice some hiccups. And I kind of feel like these Supervision watercolors handle more like a student grade watercolor would than like what I would expect from a professional grade watercolor, especially for the price. I paid $78.28 for these on AliExpress, and I don't feel like these perform up to the expectations that I would have for professional grade paint. And I find them to be expensive for the quality you receive. I realize that many Western watercolors in smaller sets cost about the same or are more expensive, but I also feel like they are capable of more than I was able to achieve with this set. The 24-piece core set is $103.52, and while it is more expensive, I also think that it is a very saturated watercolor set that is capable of performing to the quality we expect from professional grade watercolors. And given how saturated those watercolors are and how you can water them down and you can mix them, they're going to last you longer than a set like this where it is like very immediate saturation and not a lot of nuance and not a lot of in between. What about the pros and cons of the Supervision palette? This is a short list. The pros are 24 colors for around $79. Seems like it would be a pretty good deal. The packaging is very cute, very art aesthetic. It seems like it would make a good present. It is very appealing overall. The cons are a little more significant. These don't currently seem to be available on Amazon, but I swear I have seen this set on Amazon before. These are not as high quality as you would expect for professional grade watercolors. These are more like a student grade watercolor, and frankly, if you're going to be buying student grade quality anyway, there are student grade sets that are going to perform just as well, like the Mei-Liang pigment set, that are far less expensive than this set. If you're looking for a good alternative that is also attractive and better priced, I would recommend checking out Paul Rubens watercolors. Those are also from China. Those are easily available on Amazon as well as AliExpress, and they perform a lot better than these do. And I have reviewed them here on the channel if you would like to check them out. So what's my verdict? I find that these are not worth seeking out. They're better than the Supervision half pans, but if you live in the US, you already have access to better watercolors at a comparable price point, or you can put together an open stock set that's going to serve you better. While the colors come out saturated, they're only at their best at full saturation and fall apart fast when you add water or other colors. These handle more like student grade watercolors than professional grade and don't have the translucency I value in professional grade watercolors. So all in all, I would recommend that you skip this set. So what did you guys think? I found them to be incredibly saturated watercolors. They definitely have that going for them. They might be a good fit for brush calligraphers or loose floral watercolor artists, but for somebody like me who does watercolor comics and illustration, and I need to be able to mix my own colors, and I need to be able to mix skin tones, and I need to really build up this sort of nuance and subtlety, these are not such a great fit for me, and I found myself really struggling to make these work for me. They were quite promising in the initial swatch stages, but as I struggled to use them to paint a watercolor illustration, I just felt like there were better watercolors on the market that would serve my needs. Speaking of, I have a bunch of interesting Chinese watercolor reviews coming your way. So if you guys are interested in watercolor, make sure you click the subscribe button and click the bell notification to let YouTube know that you would like to see more from me. If you found this helpful, useful, and informative, I would really appreciate it if you would consider joining me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. And if you like my art and would like to see more of my art, I hope you will follow me on these social media sites. So I really enjoyed swatching and painting with the Supervision watercolors, although not really because I enjoyed using the Supervision watercolors, but because I just enjoy watercolor in general. And if you'd like to see more of my watercolor work, you can check out my watercolor webcomic, 7-inch Kara, which you guys can read for free at 7inchkara.com. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Hopefully I saved you guys some money, and hopefully I can point you guys in the direction of some watercolors that you will enjoy more. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again soon with another tutorial, art supply review, or easily influenced. Bye guys!